Forced participation produces broken men. That's the argument I want to make. And look, most people who hear that will immediately push back. They'll say Sparta produced the greatest warriors in history. They'll say the Agoge built unbreakable discipline, brotherhood, courage. They'll point to Thermopylae, 300 men holding a pass against hundreds of thousands. And they're right. All of that happened. But what they're missing, and I sat with this for a long time before I felt like I actually understood it, is what the system also produced underneath all that glory. What it did to the psychology of men who had no identity except the one the state handed them, and what happened when that identity disappeared. Because here's the thing, Sparta wasn't just an experiment in military training. It was an experiment in whether you could take a human being, strip away every choice he had about who he'd become, and replace it with a state-assigned purpose. And for a while, several centuries actually, it looked like the answer was yes. I want you to understand how total this system really was, not the movie version, the real one. The Agoge was the state-controlled education and military training program for male Spartan citizens. Mandatory, no exceptions. Girls weren't allowed in. Boys entered at 7 and graduated around 30, only then allowed to marry and start a family. 7 years old. Think about that. A boy has barely learned to speak in full sentences, and the state comes for him. The training wasn't just physical. It built an entire identity. The Agoge forged Spartan men around a specific set of values: discipline and obedience, endurance and toughness, loyalty to the state. The individual was nothing, Sparta was everything, and brotherhood above all else. Those aren't just values. That's the complete replacement of selfhood. You didn't get to discover who you were. Sparta told you. And the Agoge was the machine that made sure you believed it. The goal was transformation. Boys into soldiers whose loyalty belonged to the state and their brothers in arms. Not their families, not their families. Think about what that means psychologically. The deepest attachment a human being has, the bond to the people who raised him, deliberately cut and replaced with allegiance to an institution. And what matters to me isn't that it's cruel, though it is. It's what it reveals about the psychology underneath. What does a man become when his entire sense of self is handed to him externally? What happens when that external structure collapses? That's where the real story lives. And almost nobody talks about it. Here's what they did build first, and I want to be fair. The brotherhood was real. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta had remarkable socio-political stability. The boys' upbringing had built behaviors that encouraged cooperation and harmony. The men trained together, ate together, slept together. At 20, they officially joined the Spartan army, becoming part of a syssitia, a mess group, where they lived and ate with their comrades. There was genuine belonging there, the kind that honestly, a lot of men today are quietly starving for. You knew who your brothers were, you knew your role, you knew what you were for, and research in social psychology would actually back this up. Group identity provides basic psychological resources: connection, belonging, meaning, worth, a sense of agency. These things are real, they matter. So, in that very specific narrow sense, Sparta worked. The men felt purposeful, needed, like they were part of something larger than themselves. But, and this is the part I think we get completely wrong, most people look at Sparta and see a model, a civilization that solved the male identity problem by assigning identity from birth and enforcing it relentlessly. They see the discipline, the brotherhood, the battlefield effectiveness, and they think, that's what men need. Structure, hardness, forced participation, and they're not entirely wrong about what men need. They're wrong about what forced participation actually produces beneath the surface. The indoctrination process suppresses emotional empathy. It facilitates aggression unimpaired by commonly accepted moral values. You built a warrior, but you also deleted the man. The Agoge's real focus was producing compliant members of society who were ready to sacrifice everything for Sparta. Compliant. That word matters. Not fulfilled, not genuinely invested. Compliant. And there's an enormous psychological difference between a man who participates because he's chosen to and a man who participates because the alternative is permanent social death. Here's the thing nobody really talks about. Sparta actually named the men who failed. Spartans who couldn't complete the Agoge were denied citizenship. They became social outcasts, hypomyones, inferiors. They lost political rights, social standing, everything. And it wasn't just about the training. Each member of the mess group was required to contribute a portion of food as a condition of citizenship. Couldn't make the contribution. For any reason, poverty, injury, whatever. You lost citizenship. You became an inferior. Can you imagine carrying that label your whole life? Think about what that does psychologically. Your entire sense of worth as a man, tied to one external system, one set of requirements, falls short for any reason. And you don't just lose status. You lose the right to exist meaningfully within your civilization. This isn't brotherhood. This is conditional belonging. And conditional belonging is one of the most corrosive psychological forces there is. Because when belonging is conditional, you don't feel safe within the group. You feel anxious, constantly performing, constantly proving yourself. One failure, one sign of weakness, one deviation from the expected identity. And you become an inferior, a trembler. You get labeled. Research on masculinity actually describes this dynamic pretty clearly. Men try to embody masculine norms in order to receive acceptance from other men, which gives them a sense of belonging and self-worth. That's a real psychological drive. Sparta weaponized it. They took this natural male need, the drive to earn belonging through contribution, and turned it into a surveillance system. Every man watching every other man. Deviation wasn't tolerated quietly. It was public. Now, here's the part that genuinely surprised me when I went deep into this. Sparta collapsed. Not quickly, not dramatically. It collapsed slowly, from the inside, in the most psychologically revealing way possible. The fall of Sparta. The gradual loss of hegemony during the early 4th century BCE was marked by its defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. That shattered its military prestige, led to the emancipation of Messenia and its Helot population, and triggered a demographic and economic crisis that reduced Sparta to a regional power. But the military defeat wasn't the real collapse. The real collapse was demographic. The citizen population, men who'd completed the Agoge, declined steadily due to warfare, economic strain, and restrictive citizenship requirements. And here's what nobody says clearly enough. A system that forces participation, strips individual identity, and ties a man's worth entirely to external compliance is also one economic downturn, one battlefield loss, one earthquake away from producing a generation of men with no idea who they are, because you can force participation. You cannot force genuine investment in self. The inflexibility the Agoge programmed into men, the inability to innovate, adapt, think outside the prescribed identity. That's what led to the defeat at Leuctra in 371 BC. Thebes used unorthodox cavalry maneuvers. The Spartans couldn't counter them. Too rigid, too locked in. They couldn't adapt, because adapting requires a self, a genuine inner life that can assess a situation freshly without the constraints of a programmed identity. The Agoge had produced extraordinary warriors. It had not produced extraordinary men. And when the battlefield required extraordinary men, creative, flexible, capable of real individual judgment, Sparta had nothing left. Most people get this completely wrong when they look at Sparta. They see the strength and miss the brittleness underneath. They see the brotherhood and miss the conditional terror that maintained it. They see the participation and miss the absence of genuine choice that made it hollow at the center. So, what does this have to do with us? Right now? Today? Because we're having the same conversation again, just in different language. There are people right now who look at young men withdrawing from civic life, from work, from relationships, from community, and whose solution is essentially Spartan, force participation, remove the option to disengage, shame the men who don't comply, label them inferiors, make the cost of non-participation social death. And I get the instinct, I genuinely do. There's something deeply unsatisfying about watching men withdraw, watching them choose comfort over contribution. The impulse to just force them back into the game, it comes from a real place. But Sparta already ran that experiment for centuries, with far more social cohesion and far more brutal enforcement than we have access to today. And what it produced was men who were effective until the conditions changed, loyal until the system cracked, defined until the identity was stripped away by circumstances outside their control, and then they had nothing underneath. The question that actually matters isn't how do you force men to participate. It's what kind of participation produces men who stay psychologically whole when the external structure disappears. Because that's the real test, not how men perform when the system is working, how they handle it when it isn't. Historians actually push back on the idea that Spartan society was single-mindedly about producing soldiers. It was designed to produce citizens, but citizenship built entirely around compliance, around external performance of a prescribed identity, isn't really citizenship. It's a very sophisticated kind of cage, and what I find genuinely fascinating and a little painful about this is how recognizable it is. The Spartan man, stripped of individual identity, defined entirely by his role within the group, terrified of the label inferior. That psychological profile isn't ancient. It's alive right now in men who've built their entire sense of self around a job, a role, a relationship, a version of what a man is supposed to be. And when that structure cracks, job disappears, relationship ends, role becomes obsolete, they find themselves in exactly the same position as the hypomyones, stripped of the only self they knew how to be. The answer to that isn't more structure, it isn't more enforcement, it isn't a modern Agoge. The answer is the thing Sparta deliberately destroyed at age 7, the inner life, the genuine self that participates not because the alternative is social death, but because it's found something worth participating in. That's what produces real psychological resilience, not compliance, not forced brotherhood, not the fear of being labeled inferior, but a man who's done the harder, slower, quieter work of figuring out who he actually is, outside of what his civilization told him to be. Because when the structures fall, and they always fall, Sparta proved that pretty conclusively. The only thing left standing is the self, and if you were never allowed to build one, there's nothing there to hold. Sparta created the most feared warriors in the ancient world, and it could not survive the moment its men were asked to be more than what the system had made them. That's not a victory. That's the most expensive lesson in the history of civilization, about what happens when you mistake compliance for identity, participation for purpose, performance for a self. And the men who figure out that difference, who find genuine reasons to contribute rather than externally enforced ones, those are the men who don't need a civilization to tell them who they are. They already know.